Don't embarrass us by wearing that uniform to Melanie's wedding. Just wear the dress your mother sent. Nobody cares about your Navy career. The text message hung there. The light from the iPhone screen cast a sickly blue-gray glare across the brushed steel of my desk. Outside the reinforced blast glass of the Norfolk Command Center, a brutal Atlantic storm was rolling in. Rain lashed against the windows like handfuls of gravel. Inside the room smelled of ozone-burnt, day-old drip coffee and the metallic tang of recycled air. I stared at the words, Harold Potts, my father. My right index finger hovered over the glass screen. Tiny pale scars spider-webbed across the knuckle shrapnel from a mortar round in Fallujah 2 decades ago. My hand didn't shake. I didn't type a furious reply. I didn't type anything. My finger drifted away from the phone and settled back onto the digital tactical map spread across my secondary monitor. I was in the middle of authorizing the deployment of a carrier strike group. 3 aircraft carriers, 200 aircraft, thousands of lives. A single nod from me and the geopolitical weight of the ocean shifted. 30 years of service. 4 silver stars sitting heavy on my shoulders. But to the man who gave me his last name, I was a stain. A glitch in his perfect Southern Country Club reality. To Harold, a woman in uniform wasn't a leader. She was a failure who couldn't land a wealthy husband. She was a loud, unseemly embarrassment that needed to be hidden in the corner behind the ice sculptures and the champagne flutes. I locked the screen. Flipped the phone face down on the cold steel. I closed my eyes. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Sniper's box breathing. The only way to kill a panic attack before it breaches the perimeter. There were no tears. Crying is a biological waste of hydration. It burns energy required for survival. I hadn't cried since 1998, and I sure as hell wasn't going to start over a text message from a man who spent his life hiding behind his golf handicap. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. The metal tracks ground together with a harsh scrape. My plane ticket to Charleston sat next to my 9mm sidearm. I reached for the paper ticket. Withdrawal. That's the first lesson they drill into you at the academy. When you are outnumbered, outgunned, and lack the high ground, you pull back. You don't walk into a kill zone just because your ego tells you to. Charleston was a kill zone. The sweeping oak trees, the vanilla buttercream, the passive-aggressive whispers over crystal glasses. They had the home field advantage. My mother, Barbara, would look the other way. My sister, Melanie, would weaponize her innocence. Harold would twist the knife with a smile. I picked up the ticket, my thumbs pressed against the edges. I was going to tear it in half. Call in sick. Let Melanie have her diamond-studded fairy tale without the black sheep ruining the aesthetic. I was used to ghosts. I could just be another one. The red phone on my desk rang. The encrypted line, very few people had the clearance to ring it directly. I picked up the receiver, didn't say hello, just listened to the heavy, gravelly breathing on the other end. "You're doing it," a voice rasped. Ramon Hayes, former SEAL Master Chief, a man who had left half his right leg in a Korengal Valley ambush so my convoy could get out alive. "Doing what, Chief?" My voice was flat, empty. Running the casualty math in your head. Deciding it's easier to just take the bullet yourself so everyone else can go home happy. Ramon coughed a wet, ugly sound that rattled through the secure line. "I know that silence, Lola. It's the same dead silence you had before you called in that airstrike on our own position." I stared at the face-down phone. "It's a civilian wedding, Ramon, not a combat op. There's no strategic value in me being there." "Bullshit." The words snapped like a dry twig. "You listened to me. You have stood perfectly still, freezing your ass off on the tarmac, saluting flag-draped aluminum boxes. You've held the goddamn line your whole life for people who don't even know how to spell the word sacrifice. You are Admiral Lola Potts." He paused. I could hear the metallic clink and hiss of a Zippo lighter. "Don't you dare start running from a bunch of country club cowards now," he said. "They don't get to erase you." The line went dead. I held the receiver for a long moment. The hard plastic was warm against my ear. The dial tone hummed a steady flat note vibrating through my jaw. I slowly lowered the phone back into its cradle. I looked at the plane ticket. I didn't tear it. I folded it once, a sharp, precise crease, and placed it in my breast pocket. 0500 hours. The next morning, I stood perfectly still in front of the full-length mirror in my quarters. The civilian dress Barbara had mailed me, a muted, inoffensive beige thing, designed to make me blend into the wallpaper, lay balled up in the trash can. Instead, I felt the stiff, heavy cotton of my service dress whites. The fabric was unforgiving. The creases in the trousers were ironed sharp enough to cut paper. It wasn't just clothing, it was armor. Every stitch represented a piece of my soul I had traded to the saltwater. I picked up my ribbon rack. The metal backing pins were ice cold against my fingertips. I aligned them perfectly over my left breast pocket. Pushed the thick steel pins through the heavy white fabric. The silver star. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal. The Bronze Star with Valor. Each one a heavy, jagged weight on my chest. Each one a name of a kid who didn't make it back. Harold called them a cry for attention. Melanie called them tacky jewelry. To me, they were gravestones. And I was going to carry them right through the front door of their pristine little party. I fastened the backing clasps, adjusted the collar, checked the perfect alignment of the 4 silver stars on my shoulder boards. My reflection stared back, hard jaw, deep dark lines around the eyes, a face that had ordered men to their deaths and stayed awake every night since to pay the toll. I looked exactly like what I was, a killer who had learned how to wear a suit. I grabbed my olive drab duffel bag, slung it over my shoulder. I walked out into the Virginia dawn. The air was crisp, smelling of salt-wet asphalt and diesel fumes. I hit the unlock button on my key fob. The heavy steel door of the armored government SUV groaned open. I climbed into the driver's seat, the leather cold and stiff. I turned the key. The V8 engine didn't purr. It roared to life. A guttural, violent growl that vibrated up through the floorboards and into my boots. I gripped the steering wheel, my scarred knuckle white against the black leather. I shifted the heavy gear selector into drive. The oversized tires chewed over the wet gravel as I pulled out of the naval base heading south on Interstate 95. Toward Charleston. Toward the sweeping oaks, the polite smiles, and the suffocating hypocrisy of my own blood. This wasn't a military deployment. There would be no incoming mortar fire, no medevac choppers screaming through the sky. But the psychological shrapnel was going to tear everything apart. The Charleston air hit me like a hot, wet towel the second I stepped out of the SUV. The heavy humidity carried the smell of salt marsh, dying Spanish moss, and expensive exhaust fumes. The country club sat at the end of a long, sweeping driveway lined with ancient oak trees. It looked exactly like a postcard. It looked like a lie. I pushed the heavy car door shut. The steel latch clicked into place with a solid metallic thud. I walked onto the manicured grass. My service dress whites stood out against the sea of pastel cocktail dresses and tailored seersucker suits, like a flare in the night sky. The reception was in full swing on the outdoor terrace and spilling into the main ballroom. The smell hit me next. A nauseating, overpowering wave of vanilla buttercream frosting and cheap, overly sweet champagne. It coated the back of my throat. My eyes moved automatically. It was a reflex baked into my nervous system over 3 decades. I stopped at the edge of the patio. I did not look at the floral arrangements. I looked at the architecture. 3 exits in the main ballroom. 2 bottleneck points near the open bar. 4 security guards working the perimeter. 2 were overweight, leaning against the stone columns. 1 was actively staring at a waitress. The 4th was looking at his phone. 0 situational awareness. 0 threat. I brought my boots together. My heels clicked sharp against the marble tile. I moved my hands behind my back fingers, locking together in a perfect parade rest. Spine straight, shoulders squared. I became a statue. The whispers started immediately. Heads turned. Crystal glasses paused halfway to heavily glossed lips. They looked at the uniform. They looked at the 4 silver stars on my shoulders. But they did not see an admiral. In this zip code, a woman in a military uniform was a tragic anomaly. To them, I looked like a garbage collector who had wandered through the wrong door. Nobody stepped forward to shake my hand. Nobody offered a drink. I remained perfectly still. I separated myself entirely from the meaningless buzzing noise of the crowd. You actually did it! The voice was a low, venomous hiss. Harold Potts stepped out from behind a tower of champagne flutes. His shoulders were slightly hunched, the posture of a man getting old and fighting it every step of the way. His face was flushed red, the capillaries in his nose broken from years of gin on the rocks. He marched toward me, his expensive leather shoes scraping the marble. He stopped 2 feet away. He leaned in, speaking through clenched teeth so the neighboring tables would not hear. Small droplets of spit hit the air between us. I told you not to bring this nonsense here, Harold whispered, his voice vibrating with rage. You could have worn a normal dress. You could have blended in for one goddamn afternoon. Why can you not just stop proving how abnormal you are? I did not blink. I looked straight into his eyes. His pupils were dilated, his jaw muscles twitched. He was terrified of me, terrified of what I represented, terrified that my presence would crack the perfect, wealthy illusion he had spent his entire life building. I looked at him the way you look at a small, noisy insect trapped against a window pane. Loud, irrelevant, completely unaware of the world outside its little glass box. I did not say a single word. I let the silence hang there, heavy and suffocating. Harold's face tightened. He opened his mouth to say something else to force a reaction out of me, but the silence broke him. He swallowed hard, spun on his heel, and walked quickly toward the bar. I shifted my weight slightly. My thumb pressed hard into the palm of my hand. The dull ache grounded me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her. Barbara. Yo, my mother. She was wearing a pale pink silk dress that cost more than a junior enlisted sailor made in 3 months. She was power walking toward the catering staff, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She smelled of strong hairspray and desperate anxiety. She saw Harold storm off. Then she saw me. Barbara stopped. Her eyes dropped to the white uniform. She looked at the ribbon rack on my chest. Her lips pressed together into a thin, disappointed line. She clicked her tongue. She did not walk over. She did not ask how my drive was. She did not look me in the eye. Instead, Barbara turned her back. She reached out and began adjusting the bow tie of a man she barely knew, laughing loudly at a joke she did not hear. She chose the illusion. She protected her husband's fragile ego and left her own blood standing entirely alone in front of 100 staring strangers. My thumb pressed deeper into my palm. Lola. The voice was high-pitched, breathless, demanding attention. Melanie dragged her massive diamond-encrusted wedding dress across the floor. She lifted the heavy silk with both hands, making sure everyone watched her move. She stopped in front of me. Her hair was curled into perfect, flawless ringlets. She looked like a porcelain doll. She smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Melanie reached up and flipped a curl over her shoulder. She let out a long, theatrical sigh. Lola, really? Melanie pouted, her voice dripping with weaponized innocence. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest. Can you take some of those medals off? They are catching the light from the chandeliers. They are too distracting. Today is supposed to be my day, and everyone is staring at your chest. I looked down. The silver star. Earned in the dirt. Earned while pulling a bleeding 19-year-old kid out of a burning Humvee. The Defense Distinguished Service Medal. Earned by burying my own people. To Melanie, they were garbage. They were tacky costume jewelry, ruining the aesthetic of her photographs. I looked back up at my sister. I saw the deep, ugly jealousy hiding right behind her mascara. She wanted me to argue. She wanted me to raise my voice so she could play the victim. I gave her a slow, deliberate nod. I reached up to my chest. My fingers found the heavy steel clasps. The metal was cold. I unpinned the silver star. The sharp needle pricked the pad of my index finger. A tiny bead of blood welled up. I ignored it. I pulled the heavy metal free from the white fabric. I unpinned the next one, and the next. I held the weight of my dead friends in the palm of my hand. They clinked together, a hollow metallic sound that was completely drowned out by the jazz band playing in the background. I shoved the fistful of metals deep into my right trouser pocket. Melanie smiled, satisfied. Thank you. Now go get a drink or something. She turned and floated away back toward the center of the room, back to the flashing cameras and the cheering crowd. I did not go to the bar. I took a step backward. Away from the light. Away from the buttercream and the champagne. I moved to the far edge of the ballroom, stepping behind a massive stone pillar where the chandelier light could not reach. The shadows were thick here. They wrapped around my white uniform, swallowing me whole. I stood in the pitch black, my right hand resting in my pocket, my fingers tracing the sharp edges of the silver star. Out in the light, the crowd laughed. Glasses clinked. Harold was telling a loud joke, basking in the attention. Melanie was dancing. They were completely safe in their beautiful, ignorant little world. They had no idea. They had no idea that the countdown had already started and the bomb they had just armed in the dark was about to take their entire world apart. I stood in the dark. The shadows wrapped around the heavy white cotton of my uniform. Out there in the light, the jazz band played a slow, lazy saxophone tune. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with crab cakes and gin. I watched Harold holding court. He was laughing, clapping a local politician on the back. Ignorant, happy. A young man walked past my stone pillar. He wore a crisp navy dress blue uniform. A lieutenant. He was carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes toward the kitchen. He glanced into the shadows to avoid a passing bridesmaid. His eyes caught the stark white of my sleeve. Then they moved up to my shoulder boards. 4 silver stars. He stopped. He did not slow down. He locked his knees and stopped so fast the crystal glasses on his tray rattled against each other. I saw his Adam's apple jerk up and down. The color instantly drained from his face. He looked at me with a mix of raw terror and absolute worship. He did not say a word. He slowly, deliberately lowered the tray onto a nearby cocktail table. He turned his body toward the shadows, locked his heels together, and stood at rigid attention. A captain standing near the open bar noticed the young lieutenant. The captain followed his line of sight into the dark corner. The captain's jaw tightened. He dropped his drink. The glass shattered on the floor. The shift in gravity did not happen all at once. It spread like a virus. 1 second, it was a high society Charleston wedding. The next, the oxygen was sucked completely out of the room. The men in tailored suits did not know what was happening, but the military men did. There were over 200 active duty and retired special operators, officers, and enlisted personnel scattered across the ballroom, invited by the groom's family. They saw the lieutenant. They saw the captain. They looked into the corner. Then came the noise. Skirk! It was a violent, ear-splitting screech. 200 heavy wooden dining chairs scraping backward against the polished marble floor at the exact same second. 200 men and women shot to their feet. Civilians gasped. Some ducked, spilling red wine down their silk dresses. Harold froze, his mouth hanging open in the middle of a laugh. The saxophone player squeaked and stopped playing. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. A massive man stepped out from the center table. Commander Nate Holloway, SEAL Team 6. A man with a chest like a bank vault and knuckles covered in thick scar tissue. Holloway puffed out his chest. He took a deep breath. His voice did not just fill the room. It shattered the quiet like a sledgehammer hitting glass. Attention on deck. 200 right hands snapped to their brows. A perfect razor-sharp salute. They did not move. They did not breathe. They stared into the dark corner where my family had told me to hide. I stepped out of the shadows. The chandelier light hit the 4 silver stars on my shoulders. It illuminated the empty spaces on my chest where the medals used to be. I did not smile. I did not wave. I walked forward with the slow, measured pace of a predator. I stopped 10 feet from Harold. My father looked like he had been shot in the stomach. His face was ash white. The crystal champagne flute in his right hand shook violently, the pale liquid sloshing over the rim and dripping onto his expensive Italian leather shoes. He tried to speak. Only a pathetic, wet wheeze came out of his throat. He looked around desperate. He looked for Thomas Whitaker. Whitaker was the groom's father, a defense contractor billionaire. The man Harold had spent the last 5 years sucking up to. The man Harold thought ruled the world. Whitaker pushed his way through the frozen crowd. He walked right up to Harold. Harold managed a weak, trembling smile. Thomas, I do not know why she... Whitaker did not even look at him. He shoved his heavy forearm against Harold's chest, pushing the old man out of the way like a piece of trash blocking the road. Harold stumbled backward, his back crashing into a dessert table. Whitaker stopped in front of me. The billionaire, the man who owned half the politicians in the state, bowed his head. He turned to face the terrified crowd of civilians. For those of you who are confused, Whitaker's voice boomed thick with absolute reverence. You are standing in the presence of Admiral Lola Potts, Commander of the United States Fleet Forces, the greatest combat commander this country has produced in a generation. The illusion shattered. The country club, the money, the pastel, dresses, it all burned down in a single second. Harold stared at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He had treated a god like a stray dog. I kept my hands in my pockets. My thumb rubbed the cold, sharp edge of the silver star, hidden in the dark fabric. I looked at Harold. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing. A heavy rhythmic thud broke the silence. Thud, drag, thud, drag. Marcus Dean pushed his way to the front of the crowd. He was a retired Marine Force recon scout. He was missing his left leg from the knee down. He leaned heavily on his aluminum forearm crutches. Marcus stopped next to Whitaker. He turned his scarred, weathered face toward my father. Marcus bared his teeth. He growled, his voice raw and thick with old grief. She is not just an admiral. Marcus spat, glaring at the Potts family. She is the woman who sat in the dirt and guarded my wife's bleeding body for 6 hours, under heavy mortar fire. She held the line so my wife would not die alone in the mud. Marcus slammed his crutch hard against the marble floor. The sound cracked like a gunshot. That is something you country club cowards will never, ever understand. The room erupted. Not with polite applause. It was a roar. The military personnel broke protocol and started clapping, a deafening, violent wave of respect and validation. The civilians joined in, desperate to be on the right side of the room. They chanted my name. They cheered. I stood in the center of it all. I did not raise my hand to acknowledge them. I did not look at Melanie, who was crying tears of pure humiliation next to her ruined wedding cake. I kept my eyes locked on Harold. He was broken. The sentence had been passed, but the cheering did not make me feel victorious. The clapping grew louder. It bounced off the marble walls. Clap, clap, clap. I closed my eyes. The sound started to warp. The clapping morphed. It turned sharp. Metallic. Crack, crack, crack. Rifle fire. The smell of vanilla buttercream faded. A thick metallic stench coated my tongue. Copper, burnt hair, diesel fuel. The crystal chandeliers above me flickered and burned out. They were replaced by the blinding, blood-red glare of a parachute flare lighting up a jagged mountain ridge. I opened my eyes, but I was not in Charleston anymore. I was looking at a 19-year-old combat medic, his chest ripped open, screaming my name over the deafening roar of a Black Hawk helicopter. The clapping bounced off the marble walls of the Charleston Country Club. 200 people cheering, men in expensive suits, women in silk dresses, all staring at me like I was a hero. Clap, clap, clap. The sound hit my eardrums, but it did not register as applause. My brain, hardwired by 3 decades of violence, started to misfire. Clap, clap, clap. The rhythm accelerated. It grew sharp, hard, metallic. Crack, crack, crack. Tunnel vision slammed down on me like a steel blast door. The edges of the grand ballroom turned black. The glowing crystal chandeliers above the dance floor warped, stretched, and ignited into the blinding, blood-red glare of parachute flares burning over a jagged mountain ridge. The heavy, sickening smell of vanilla buttercream frosting vanished. It was instantly replaced by the sharp chemical stench of cordite burning diesel fuel and raw hot copper. Blood. So much blood. I was not in South Carolina anymore. I was 15 years in the past. Korangale Valley, Afghanistan. The roar of the Black Hawk helicopter's twin engines was deafening, shaking my teeth in my skull. The high-altitude air was thin, freezing, and choked with brown dust. We were taking heavy fire from the tree line. Thwack, thwack, thwack. D, S, H, K. Heavy machine gun rounds punching through the aluminum fuselage of the chopper like a hammer through drywall. I was a colonel then, kneeling on the slick, blood-soaked metal floor of the Bird. We had 2 casualties on the floor plates. One was a CIA intelligence officer. His chest was wrapped in pressure bandages soaking through fast. He was clutching a waterproof Pelican drive to his chest. On that drive were coordinates, cell networks, intel that could dismantle a terror cell planning to hit a forward operating base of 3,000 Marines. The other was a kid, a 19-year-old Marine sniper. His left leg was gone below the knee. The tourniquet was slipping. His face was the color of wet ash. "Too heavy!" The crew chief screamed over the rotor wash, his voice cracking over the comms. He was pointing frantically at the altimeter, then down at the tree line, where muzzle flashes blinked like deadly fireflies. "Air is too thin. We can't clear the ridge with this weight, we're taking fire. We need to drop 200 pounds right fucking now, or we all burn." We were maxed out. The math was absolute. Gravity and physics do not care about bravery. One of them had to get off the Bird. "Colonel," the pilot screamed over the radio, "make the call 5 seconds." I looked at the intelligence officer. He was unconscious. The hard drive was secure. I looked at the kid, the sniper. His eyes were wide, dilated with shock and morphine. He reached out with a trembling, blood-slicked hand and grabbed the heavy nylon webbing of my tactical vest. His fingers dug in. "Ma'am," he choked out. Blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. "Please, my mom. I just want to see my mom." Triage, the ugliest word in the English language. You play God with a clipboard. You calculate the value of a human soul against the strategic needs of the United States government. The intel saves 3,000 men. The kid is just a kid. The cold mechanical part of my brain took over. The part that earned me those 4 silver stars. I looked the 19-year-old boy directly in his terrified eyes. "I'm sorry, son," I said. I reached down. I pried his bloody fingers off my vest. I looked at the crew chief and gave the hand signal. A sharp downward motion. Cut him loose. The crew chief's face went pale under his visor, but he obeyed. He grabbed the back of the sniper's plate carrier. He dragged the boy to the edge of the open door. "No, no, please," the boy screamed. The crew chief shoved him out into the freezing dirt of the landing zone. The Black Hawk instantly gained altitude, the engines screaming as we cleared the jagged rocks of the ridge by inches. I leaned out the door, looking down. The boy was lying in the mud, reaching a hand up toward the sky as the tracer rounds chewed into the dirt around him. He was screaming my name, screaming for his mother. His scream was drowned out by the rotors. A sharp stabbing pain in my palm snapped me back. I blinked hard. The red flares faded back into crystal chandeliers. The cordite vanished, replaced by the suffocating smell of spilled champagne. I was standing in the corner of the Charleston ballroom. The crowd was still cheering. Marcus Dean was still standing there on his aluminum crutches, looking at me with fierce, unwavering respect. A cold sweat coated the back of my neck. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I kept my face entirely blank. I controlled my breathing. Inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 4. I looked down at my right hand. It was buried deep in my trouser pocket. I had gripped the silver star so hard that the heavy backing pin had pierced the skin of my thumb. The pain was sharp, grounding. I left the pin buried in my skin. I needed it. The civilians around me were clapping for a hero. They looked at the medals I usually wore on my chest and saw shiny jewelry. They saw Hollywood action movies. They saw glory. My family saw them as tacky trash that ruined a wedding aesthetic. None of them knew the truth. Every piece of metal I carried was a mobile gravestone. The silver star in my pocket belonged to that 19-year-old kid in the Korengal. I put him in the dirt. I traded his life for a hard drive, and the Navy gave me a piece of ribbon for it. I shifted my weight. My shoulders sagged just a fraction of an inch. The exhaustion was a physical weight, a heavy lead blanket draped over my spine. I was so goddamn tired of carrying the dead. The clapping finally began to die down. The jazz band, sensing the shift in the room, nervously picked up their instruments and started playing a low, quiet tune. The guests began whispering to each other, stealing awestruck glances in my direction. The dark spell of the room was broken by the sound of frantic scraping leather. Harold Potts was moving. The paralyzing fear that had gripped my father a minute ago was gone. It had been entirely replaced by the parasitic survival instinct of a desperate man. Harold had just watched a defense billionaire and 200 lethal operators bow to his daughter. He realized the social capital in the room had shifted. I was no longer a stain to be hidden. I was the ultimate prize. He shoved past a state senator, nearly knocking the man over. Harold's face was slick with nervous sweat. His comb-over had come loose, a thin strand of gray hair plastered to his wet forehead. He reached the main head table right next to the massive multi-tiered wedding cake. He grabbed a heavy wooden chair and dragged it out. It scraped loudly against the marble. "Lola!" Harold yelled, his voice cracking. He tried to sound authoritative, tried to sound like the proud patriarch, but he just sounded pathetic. He waved his hand frantically. "Come on up here, sit." Harold barked, looking around to make sure Thomas Whitaker was watching him. "Of course she sits with family. Blood is blood, right, folks? Best seat in the house for my girl." He patted the back of the chair. He smiled. It was a greasy, desperate smile. He was a tick trying to burrow into my skin, trying to siphon off the respect these people had just given me so he wouldn't be exiled from his country club. I slowly pulled my hand out of my pocket. I wiped the small smear of blood from my thumb onto the dark seam of my trousers. I stepped out of the shadows completely. I walked toward the head table. The crowd parted for me like water. No one spoke. I stopped right in front of Harold. I did not look at the chair. I looked at him. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I did not give him the satisfaction of an argument. I just looked down at him. My eyes were completely hollow, cold, stripped of all human warmth. I looked at him with the exact same dead mechanical stare I used when zipping up a black body bag on a flight deck. Harold's fake smile twitched. His hand, still resting on the back of the chair, began to tremble. The temperature between us dropped to 0. He slowly realized that he hadn't just invited his daughter to the table. He had invited the Reaper. The Atlantic wind whipped across the Charleston harbor. It carried the sharp, biting sting of salt, dead marsh grass, and diesel fuel. I stood at the very edge of the concrete pier, far away from the glowing lights of the country club. The jazz music was a faint, pathetic hum behind me. I struck a match. The sulfur flared, casting a harsh orange glow against the pitch-black water. I lit a thick, cheap cigar. It was a habit I picked up from a master chief in Fallujah, a man who used heavy tobacco to mask the smell of burned skin on the convoy routes. Footsteps scraped against the wooden planks behind me. Slow, hesitant. I did not turn around. I blew a thick cloud of gray smoke out over the water. Melanie stepped into my peripheral vision. The fairy tale bride was gone. The bottom of her heavy diamond-encrusted dress dragged through the puddles stained brown and black with mud and motor oil. Her perfect curls were plastered to the side of her face by the ocean wind. Thick black mascara ran down her cheeks in jagged, ugly lines. She wrapped her arms around her chest, shivering violently in the cold. "They were terrified of you," Melanie whispered. Her voice was raspy, completely stripped of that weaponized, high-pitched innocence she used in the ballroom. I took another drag of the cigar. The cherry burned hot red in the dark. "Every time you got promoted. Every time you went overseas." Melanie choked out, staring down at the wooden planks. "They got smaller. You were too big, Lola. You made them feel completely useless. So they held on to me. I was weak. I was safe. I needed their money. I let them treat me like a child because it made them feel like they were still in charge." She looked up at me. Her eyes were wide, pathetic. She was begging for absolution, begging for a hug. I gave her nothing. Just a slow, silent nod. Melanie's shoulders slumped. She turned and walked back toward the lights of the club, looking like a ghost, dragging a dirty white sheet. Before her footsteps faded completely, another shadow stepped out from behind a stack of rusted shipping crates. Barbara. My mother smelled of stale pink Zinfandel and decades of suffocating fear. She did not look at me. She looked at the tips of her expensive designer shoes. "I kept them," Barbara said. Her voice shook. It was dry and brittle, like dead leaves crushing under a boot. "The newspaper clippings. The articles about your Silver Star. The Navy Times feature when you got your command." I slowly turned my head and looked at her. I cut them out, she sobbed, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. I kept them in a shoebox, hidden under the heavy winter coats in the hall closet. For 30 years. I wanted to frame them. I really did. But if Harold saw them... She trailed off, choking on her own guilt. If Harold saw them, he would break things. He would scream for hours. I just wanted to keep the peace, Lola. I am so sorry. A mother's pride, reduced to contraband hidden in a dark closet. It was a crime in this family to acknowledge my survival. I exhaled a long stream of smoke. The wind tore it away instantly. Go inside, Barbara, I said, my voice entirely flat. It is cold. She flinched at the sound of her first name. She wiped her face, turned, and scurried away like a frightened mouse running from a trench line. I was alone again. But only for a minute. The final set of footsteps was heavy, dragging against the concrete. Harold Potts walked to the edge of the water. He stopped 3 feet away from me. The dictator was gone. The arrogant patriarch who had sneered at my uniform was dead. The man standing next to me was a hollow, dried-out husk. His tailored suit looked 2 sizes too big, hanging off his frame like a burial shroud. His shoulders were caved in. He looked at the black water rolling against the concrete pilings. He was cornered. His entire social empire had been dismantled in less than 5 minutes by a defense billionaire and a retired Marine with 1 leg. Harold clenched his fists. He tried to summon the old rage, the bullying tone that had ruled this family for 40 years. Why? Harold hissed. His voice was a wet, ragged rasp. Why did you not just tell me? Why did you not say you were running the whole damn Navy? You let me treat you like a... He could not finish the sentence. The words died in his throat. I took the cigar from my mouth. I looked at the glowing red ash. Then I pressed the cherry directly into the rusted iron railing. Hiss! The ember died instantly, leaving a black scorch mark on the metal. I turned my head and locked my eyes onto his. Because you never wanted to know. The words were quiet, cold. They punched straight through his ribs. Harold physically recoiled. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on an uneven wooden plank. He caught himself on the railing, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. The armor of his wealth, his country club memberships, his expensive gin, it all shattered against the concrete. He stared down at the dark, churning water of the harbor. The wind howled through the steel cables of the docked boats, a high, lonely sound. Harold opened his mouth. His jaw trembled violently. 1967, he whispered to the ocean. I remained perfectly still. I did not interrupt the execution. 1967. Harold repeated, his voice cracked, tearing at the seams. I got the letter, the draft board. They called my name. He gripped the rusted iron rail so hard his knuckles turned bone white in the dark. My father made 3 phone calls. He paid a private doctor in Richmond $10,000, forged a medical file, asthma, bone spurs, whatever it took. Harold closed his eyes. The tears finally spilled over cutting tracks through the expensive cologne and cold sweat on his face. Tommy went. Tommy was my best friend. We played baseball in the street. Tommy stepped on a landmine outside Da Nang. They brought him back in a closed casket. There was nothing left. The Atlantic wind bit into my face. I stood silent, watching the old man break apart. Then you grew up, Harold choked out. He looked at my white uniform. He looked at the empty spaces on my chest where the medals used to be. You put on that uniform. You went to the desert. You faced death. Every time you walked into a room, you reminded me of what I was. A coward. A rich, pathetic coward. He dropped to his knees. The expensive fabric of his suit pants soaked up the dirty, oily puddle water on the pier. I thought if I made you small, if I crushed your career, I would not feel so ashamed. He sobbed, burying his face in his trembling, liver-spotted hands. I am sorry. God, I am so sorry. 30 years. 30 years of standing in the shadows. 30 years of being told I was broken, abnormal, a stain on the Potts family name. I had spent my entire adult life building an armor of discipline, thinking I was fundamentally flawed because my own blood could not look me in the eye. All those holidays sitting in the corner, All those phone calls where they hung up the moment I mentioned a deployment. And it was all a projection. A massive, pathetic lie. I was not the failure. I was a mirror. A polished silver mirror reflecting a draft dodger's eternal shame. I looked down at the man crying at my feet. I did not feel anger. I did not feel the need to scream. I did not want to kick him into the harbor. I looked at him with the absolute profound pity of a giant staring at a crushed insect. "Keep your pride, Dad," I said. My voice was completely hollow, dead. "You have to live the rest of your life with it anyway." I did not wait for an answer. I turned my back on him. I walked away, my heavy boots hitting the concrete in a steady, measured rhythm. The darkness of the pier swallowed me, leaving nothing behind but the cold ocean wind and the pathetic, wretched sobbing of a man who had finally met himself in the dark. My internal clock never cared about time zones, jet lag, or the suffocating drama of civilian life. 30 years in the military wired my brain to wake up before the sun, regardless of where my boots were resting. I did not wear the service dress whites this morning. The armor had done its job. I pulled on a heavy navy blue wool sweater, faded denim jeans, and laced up my scuffed combat boots. I grabbed the olive drab canvas duffel bag. It felt lighter today. The hotel lobby was a tomb. It smelled of industrial bleach and stale recycled air conditioning. The crystal chandeliers were turned off, leaving the vast expanse of the marble floors bathed in a cold gray pre-dawn light. The silence was thick. He was waiting near the revolving glass doors. Harold. There was no tailored seersucker suit, no silk tie, no expensive scotch in his hand. He wore a wrinkled gray t-shirt and loose khakis. He looked incredibly small. His shoulders slouched forward, the arrogant spine completely drained of its poison. He stood there, shivering slightly in the cold lobby. His liver-spotted hands were wrapped tightly around a battered cardboard box. The edges of the box were frayed, water-damaged, taped and retaped over the years. I walked toward him. My heavy boots thudded against the marble. Slow, measured. Harold looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, swollen from a long night of staring at the ceiling and finally seeing the ugly truth of his own cowardice. He held the box out to me. His hands shook so violently the dry cardboard vibrated against his chest. "I kept them," Harold whispered. His voice was completely stripped of its usual booming authority. It sounded like a dry branch snapping underfoot. "The letters you wrote from boot camp. From your first deployment to the Gulf. When you were 18. I stopped. I looked at the rough, dry cardboard. I didn't reach for it. I read every single one. Harold choked out. A fresh tear spilled over his lower lid, tracking through the deep wrinkles of his face. "I was always proud, Lola. I swear to God I was. I couldn't face it. You went out there and did what I was too cowardly to do. You faced the fire, and it made me hate myself. So I took it out on you. I tried to make you small so I could feel big. An unconditional surrender, handed over in a beat-up box at 5 a.m. I reached out and took the cardboard box. The paper was dry, brittle under my scarred fingers. It weighed almost nothing, but it held 30 years of ghosts. Ding. The brass elevator doors slid open behind him. Melanie ran out. The flawless porcelain doll from last night was gone. She was wearing baggy sweatpants and an oversized college hoodie. Her perfect curls were a tangled rat's nest. She hadn't washed her face. Thick streaks of black mascara stained her cheeks. She looked desperate, terrified that the human shield I provided was leaving, exposing her to the rotting core of this family. "Lola, wait!" Melanie sprinted across the lobby. She grabbed my forearm. Her grip was tight, her manicured nails digging into the thick wool of my sweater. "Don't go yet. Please. Stay for breakfast. Just coffee and eggs. We can sit down. We can talk about everything. We're a family." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. Then I looked at her face. My eyes were dead calm. The war was over. There was no anger left in my chest, no bitterness, just the vast empty space where my desperate need for their approval used to live. I reached over with my free hand. I grabbed Melanie's wrist. I didn't squeeze hard, but I applied enough tactical pressure to a nerve cluster to make her flinch and let go. I peeled her fingers off my sweater. I stepped back, putting 2 feet of cold marble between us. No hugs, no tears, no dramatic speeches. 30 years of psychological abuse did not get wiped clean by a morning apology and a plate of scrambled eggs. Forgiveness is a luxury. Boundaries are survival. I looked at Harold. I gave him a single slow nod, an acknowledgement of his surrender. Nothing more. I turned around and pushed through the heavy revolving glass door. The morning air outside was freezing. It bit into my face, sharp, salty, and clean. I walked to the black armored SUV parked under the concrete awning. The heavy steel door groaned in protest as I pulled it open. I tossed the cardboard box and my duffel bag onto the passenger seat. The door slammed shut with a solid metallic thud, sealing me inside the quiet, insulated cabin. I turned the ignition. The massive V8 engine roared to life, a deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my boots. I shifted the heavy gear selector into drive. The thick tires crushed the white gravel of the driveway. I did not check the rearview mirror. I left the country club, the Spanish moss, and the rotting ruins of the Potts family ego in the dirt. I merged onto the empty highway just as the sun broke over the Atlantic horizon. The bright, blinding light pierced the armored windshield. It washed over the dark dashboard, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cabin. The sunlight hit my face. It warmed the deep lines around my eyes and the pale shrapnel scars on my jaw. I gripped the leather steering wheel. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of old leather and cold AC. I held it for 4 seconds. Then I exhaled. A long, heavy breath. The last piece of the burden blew out of my chest and vanished. I was free. An hour later, I pulled into a grimy Exxon gas station just off Interstate 95. The place smelled of raw, unleaded gasoline, wet asphalt, and the burnt black coffee brewing inside the convenience store. I stepped out into the biting wind to pump gas. I grabbed the heavy rubber-coated nozzle, shoved it into the tank, and squeezed the metal trigger. "Excuse me, ma'am." I turned my head. Standing near a rusted ice machine was a girl. 19, maybe 20 years old. She wore a faded olive-drab utility jacket and a dark blue ball cap with the Navy crest stitched in gold on the front. A fresh recruit. She was holding a cheap styrofoam cup of coffee, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. She recognized the scars. She recognized the face from the command portraits hanging in the halls of every naval base in the country. The kid's spine instantly snapped straight. She dropped her coffee cup into a nearby trash can, completely ignoring the hot liquid splashing onto her boots. She locked her knees, brought her heels together. She raised her right hand, fingers perfectly straight, the tip of her index finger touching the brim of her cap. A textbook razor-sharp salute. Her eyes were burning with pure, unfiltered reverence. I looked at her. I didn't see a stranger at a gas station. I saw the future. I saw the exact reason I carried the weight. I brought my own hand up. A slow, precise return salute. I held it for 2 seconds, acknowledging her, acknowledging us. Standing there in the middle of a dirty, oil-stained parking lot, breathing in the toxic fumes of gasoline, it finally hit me. I never needed Harold Potts to look at me. I never needed my mother to put my clippings on the fridge. I didn't need a seat at a table covered in vanilla buttercream. Family is not the blood in your veins. It is the people who know exactly what it costs to keep the wolves in the dark. My value wasn't decided in a Charleston country club. It was forged in the freezing dirt of the Korengal. It was cemented on the steel decks of aircraft carriers in the middle of the Pacific. My name is Lola Potts. I am an admiral of the United States Navy. And out there on the deep blue water, they speak my name like a prayer. You spend your whole life carrying the ghosts of the people you couldn't save. It grinds you down. It makes you feel completely isolated when you walk through a grocery store or sit at a holiday dinner. You look at the civilians around you, laughing, complaining about traffic, or a cold cup of coffee, and you feel like an alien. You think no one understands. But you do not need them to understand. You do not need to explain your scars to people who have never held a weapon. You do not need to prove your worth to people whose biggest crisis is a bad Wi-Fi connection. The silence you carry is not a weakness. It is a shield. It is the quiet power of a survivor who knows exactly what they are made of. Let them have their ignorance. Let them have their comfortable, fragile little lives. You earned your peace in the fire. Now take a deep breath, start the engine, and leave them behind. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. We share raw, unfiltered stories of survival, quiet power, and holding the line. Until next time, stay strong, and I'll see you in the next one.